So welcome to our third Thursday training, and tonight is looking at the responsibilities for clerk of session. This is not exhaustive, as this is not meant to cover every jot and tittle. There's always more to learn, but hopefully we'll give some of that basic framework, maybe answer some questions, maybe be some new information, because we have two clerks. We have three people on here who have been involved in this work for a while. So let's begin, as every good Presbyterian meeting is supposed to, with prayer. Gracious and loving God, thank you for these late summer days when the evenings are a little cooler and the sun, while bright in the sky, feels a little less hot. Thank you for the opportunity to gather, to come together and talk about this really important role in the life of our churches. I'm so grateful for those who say yes to serving in this capacity, to keeping our minutes, to recording our history, so that generations to come can look back and see what the church has done, see how we have been engaged in mission and ministry. So be with us in this time, and I pray that you will bless all those who serve as our clerks of session. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so I'm going to share my screen. Hope you all can see that. Yeah, okay. So we're gonna begin by looking at session minutes, which in a lot of ways are the heart of the position and role. And then we're gonna end with taking a quick look at the things that are in our session minute annual review and see where those come together. So I was going to start off with like a kind of tongue-in-cheek quiz, like the purpose of the annual session minutes review is A, to embarrass me, B, to make me feel bad, C, to tell me everything I'm doing wrong, or D, to give me an opportunity to gather with other people doing this work, to learn together, laugh together, and celebrate the life of our church. If you're wondering, it's D. But I ran out of the creative juice, and I said, I'm just going to focus on this stuff. And Sandra says all of the above. You may feel A, B, and C, but that is not the purpose. So the purpose of our minutes, they are a historical record. They preserve the decisions of the session. They do indeed record the important events in the life of the church. They are part of what proves both to the session and congregation and to the presbytery that Book of Order requirements are being followed. And then they can be used. A lot of sessions will post their session minutes or send out the actions taken to the congregation as a way of keeping the congregation informed. So it may feel like an administrative task, but each of your churches has a long history. And from the beginning, the decisions of the session were recorded in some way. And that gives us this amazing historical insight into the life of our churches. In fact, the Presbyterian Church is known for our historical preservation. And you'll hear a little bit more about it at the end, but we have our own Presbyterian Historical Society that will hold minutes of churches that have closed, will hold minutes for churches that say, we don't need 300 years worth of minutes in our property. We can send, 250 years worth to the Presbyterian Historical Society, where you have access. You have access at any time. And so it's a way to give a snapshot into the life of the church. Moving on. They do have a particular form, and they need to be typed. Of course, they weren't typed 300 years ago. They were handwritten, and those are very difficult to read, much less put it in a searchable PDF. So now they do need to be typed. The good news, though, is that there is not a requirement to buy and use the special session minutes book. I know those are expensive. Whew. And those pages can be difficult because they're not the same size. And anyway, you don't have to use the book. You are welcome to. There's nothing that would prevent you from using it. But you can just use regular printer paper because, as you see, all paper is now acid-free, and that's the only requirement for the paper. And so you can use any kind of secure binder. For those of you who have been to one of our minute review sessions, you know that the presbytery will offer to bind your minutes for you. And it's actually right here to my side. I have the fancy binding machine. And so we are able to bind the minutes on an annual basis if you like. Or you can do that yourself as long as it's secure, that once the minutes have been reviewed, it's not easy to take out and replace going forward. They're meant to be a firm record, a complete record of the previous year. The pages do need to be numbered consecutively. And so if you're using one of the traditional big minutes books, those numbers continue. For those who are doing a binding year to year, the numbers can start with 1 at the beginning of the year. But basically, whatever's in the binder should be numbered consecutively. And that helps us know the order. And as the pages are prepared, they need to be front and back. And so double-sided pages is part of the form as well. And you may see me, and you may do it yourself. If you finish the minutes of a meeting and there's a blank space at the bottom of the page, it's appropriate to cross it out. That's one of the ways to show that the minutes end here and nothing will be added further. When I sign off the minutes at the annual minutes review, if there's a big space on that page for me to sign off, I'll do that. I'll put a slash through that space and sign at the bottom to show that this is where the minutes have ended and have been reviewed to. If you do need to make a correction retroactively, which sometimes someone will realize, oh my gosh, I totally missed it when we approved those minutes. As you see, you can do a simple cross out and add the correction in writing at that point, since they're already bound. But otherwise, most corrections as they come meeting to meeting when minutes are approved, those are just made, and those minutes then are approved as corrected, as amended. Any questions about the form?
Cindy, I have a question.
Yeah.
You say that they should be put in binders. Is it not okay for, I know some clerks are starting to use the computer in a specific drive? That's
Yeah,
not
so
the same, correct?
there are multiple ways to save the minutes, but there is supposed to be a paper copy. We are not
Okay.
yet at the point where we don't require that.
Right.
That may happen before too long, so we can affix an electronic signature. But there's nothing wrong with keeping the record of the minutes on your computer, and then, yeah.
Printing them out.
When you do it that way, though, you need to be sure, once the minutes are approved, to save that as a PDF. and you can
Okay,
save that as a, it's called an archive PDF, so it can't be changed.
right,
As long as it's in, .doc or .docx or a document form, it can be tampered with
right.
easily. So once minutes are approved, if they're electronic, they need to be saved and converted to a PDF. Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions about form?
Are you going to talk about the review process next?
Well, we're going to talk about what goes in the minutes. But yes, we will get to the review process.
Okay, because mine is more about the review process.
Okay. If you find you have to jump off before we get there, go ahead and interrupt and we'll do it then.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So, style, questions of style. Guess what? Each of you has your own style. And it's one of the fun things which reveals how much of a Presbyterian nerd I am. It's one of the fun things to read through minutes and see the different styles of different clerks, how things are recorded, how things are described. Some clerks are very terse and to the point. You get the motions, and that's about it. Some clerks include everything. The clerk of session at the last church I served would put in whole narrative paragraphs, and we'd have to go back and say, some of these things don't need to be, and some of them shouldn't be in the permanent minutes of the session. And there's everything in between. One of the things that I try to keep in mind, because I prepare the minutes for the presbytery, is that it is a historical record. And so when I am, recording minutes that's required, or recording motions is required. No ifs, ands, or buts. You need the exact language of the motion. But sometimes some other language can be helpful, especially if the motion was a difficult one, if there's a lot of debate, to include some of that context. Because looking back, 50 years from now, someone may look back and say, well, I see the motion, I see the action that was taken, but how'd they come to that? So there's some balancing there as you think about style. You do want the decisions, the actions, to be easy to find. A good way to do that is to use bolded script or italic script. My style is I bold. So those pop out on the page and I can see these are the action points. Some people in the minutes move all the actions, all the things the session approved, to the top of the minutes. And so even though they may have happened throughout the meeting, the actions are all gathered at the top of the minutes, and then the rest of the meeting is the bulk of the meeting is then gone through in the rest of the minutes. So there are ways to make your own style. We should, use complete sentences. Again, these are historical documents, and someday down the road, someone's going to look back and read your minutes. So think about the language you're using. Think about how you're describing things. Think about how you're describing situations as well. You don't need to include things like moved, seconded, approved, or as you see, there are different shortened versions of that. It's not necessary. Once the motion is approved, that's all we need. We don't need to know who made it or who seconded it. As far as the minutes are concerned, as far as the record is concerned, what is essential is that motion itself. So all you need to do is include, approved the minutes, voted to approve the minutes. It's somewhat, it's secondary, the rest of the information. However, if you want to include that, if that's something that's important in the culture of your congregation to include that kind of information, you're welcome to. You're just not required to. Any questions on that piece? And this will be available as a PDF, so you don't have to try to write it all down. And so the retention of minutes forever. Now, that does not mean that you have to keep them forever. They can be, as I said earlier, given to the Presbyterian Historical Society for their safekeeping. They have the technology, they have the proper level of humidity and the balance of heat and cool. They have these amazing stacks in the basement of their building. So don't throw away your minutes. If you find old minutes books, we can take them to the Presbyterian Historical Society. As it says, it's good to keep a backup, and that can be on your computer. It could be in a fireproof safe somewhere if you have one of those. Now, given our use of technology now, if something happens, like if you as clerk of session have your computer completely fail and it's wiped out, everything's gone, most likely you have emailed minutes to the session or to the office. And so you will be able to recreate the collection of minutes. It's just something to keep in mind. A side note, at our September Presbytery meeting, September 20th Presbytery meeting, which is being hosted by the Wacomico Presbyterian Church in Salisbury, one of the archivists from the Presbyterian Historical Society is joining us. He's going to do a pre-Presbytery presentation starting at 3 p.m. on the 20th on the history of early Presbyterianism in the colonies. And then during the meeting, he's going to talk a bit about the mission of the Presbyterian Historical Society. It's in Philadelphia. It's just right here. So that meeting will be hybrid. So those pieces will be available through Zoom. But if you've got questions about your minutes, questions about artifacts, again, a lot of our churches have a long history. You could have an opportunity to talk to David Staniunas. He's a really fantastic person. I'm thrilled that the Presbytery will get to meet him. All right. Attendance for session minutes. So this is usually one of the things that's at the top of our minutes. A good practice can be to keep in front of you the list of all the session members with their classes. The reason to do that is, every year people are elected or re-elected. And so you can see really clearly with that list in front of you with every meeting, where people are. Are they in their second term? Are they halfway through? It's one of those pieces that can be helpful when the nominating committee says, who's going off, who's been on, those kinds of things. Of course, you indicate who's present, and part of that is showing the quorum. By indicating who's present, the quorum is established there. You don't have to include who's absent. You don't have to list excused absences. It's not required. If that is something you do, then that's fine. It's not prohibited. But yeah, you can choose to do it either way. That's one of those style questions. All right, digging into what's in the minutes themselves. Any questions before we dig into this? All right. So every set of minutes, in addition to the attendance, needs to record the date, time, and place or platform for the meeting. Many of us are using Zoom right now for session meetings, and certainly during 2020, we learned how to use Zoom for session meetings. Again, keeping in mind the historical reference, in 50 years, Zoom may not exist anymore. We may have holograms. And we may be, presenting ourselves, we may all be beamed up somewhere. Who knows? Technology is amazing. So sometimes less specific language like video conference can be helpful to unpack what Zoom is. That sounds like Mazda, right? Zoom. So that, again, keeping in mind the purpose of the minutes as historical value. Always record that the meeting was opened with prayer. Always record who's moderating. That's one of those things that the moderator is an important person. If you have an installed pastor at your church, the installed pastor is the moderator of the session. If you have a temporary pastor or interim or transitional pastor, then that person is appointed as moderator by our Committee on Ministers and Congregations, COMC. If there isn't a moderator present, in the case of an installed pastor, that person has the authority to appoint another moderator in their place. But in the case of a temporary pastor, an interim pastor, transitional pastor, if that pastor is not able to moderate, then it's actually for us, the chair of COMC, who has the authority to appoint. It's a small piece in our polity, a little difference there between being installed and being in a temporary status. So record the name of the moderator. That's part of showing that the meeting is decent and in good order. And so you see an example. The session of this place convened with prayer, open with prayer, via how? Were we in person? Were we hybrid? What did we use? By the name of the moderator, on, date, and time. If you look at the presbytery minutes, you'll see the same kind of information right there at the top of the minutes. So that's standard. One of the things I do, actually, if it's helpful, I take my minutes on my computer while the meeting's going on, and I have a template. I've set up a template for my meetings. Presbytery meetings usually start at either 4 on a Tuesday or 10 on a Saturday. So I have an afternoon template and a morning template. And my templates have a lot of things preset. They're already in there. I know that we are going to open the meeting with prayer. I know, the attendance roll will be attached. That's how we do it at the presbytery level. So my template has all of that preloaded, and then I just put in the specifics. It's a little time saver. And for the things that happen every month, it's a reminder, this is supposed to happen. And it means I don't have to type as much. And that's a good thing. So from the opening section, again, a major thing that we record in our minutes is our motions and our voting. Anything the session votes on has to be recorded. If it's not recorded, it didn't happen. At least not in terms of the session minutes. So if there's a conversation and everyone agrees to do something, but it doesn't get into the minutes, then that agreement is essentially missing and doesn't exist in the life of the church. And this includes agreement by consensus. A lot of our smaller churches, including the churches I've pastored, will often agree by consensus. So it's not necessarily a vote. And then you say, by consensus, the session decided to make this donation to the annual town Christmas party, whatever. So whatever the decisions are, they have to be recorded. And they need to be recorded specifically. So in this example, the session voted, you see how that's bolded, to allow the Boy Scouts to meet in the church hall, church fellowship hall. So you could say the session voted to allow the Boy Scouts to use the church. That's accurate. But by recording the full motion and by recording the details, if someone says, wait a minute, did we say they could use it on Saturdays? Or did we only say they could use it on Wednesdays? You've got that information. If it's a blanket, the session voted the Boy Scouts could use the church. Well, then the session voted the Boy Scouts could use the church. And then you get into situations where you might be having to come back and say, well, can they use it on Saturday? Can they use it on these other dates and times? So having good specific motions, especially things around building use, around staffing decisions, anything that has place implications or dollar implications, it's really important to have that nailed down and specific. You don't have to include, unanimously. Everyone was in favor. It's not important. What's important is that the motion was approved. You don't have to include a breakdown unless somebody requests it. If somebody requests, please show that I voted against, please show that I abstained, then you include that in the minutes. But otherwise, once the action's taken, and it is the action of the body. And this is the moderator's job to moderate how the vote is taken. Did I hear a question?
I have a question.
Yes.
Yeah. What about, you don't mention in here, but I still think it would be important to record the motions that are not approved too. So that you can, so that you have a record, like we voted on that last year and we voted it down. So what's different about what you're bringing up this year?
Yeah, and that is still an action. So an action not to approve is still an action and still a vote. And a consensus not to do something, it is still an action of the body. Yeah, so if the vote is no, the session voted not to approve. Okay. But once a motion's made, it goes in the minutes. Whether it's approved, disapproved, referred, referred back to the committee, anything that is moved and seconded goes in the minutes. And then what happens to it is what the minutes reflect. Yeah. Good call.
Thanks.
Yeah. So most months, the clerk will have a report to the session. And sometimes that's just verbal, but sometimes you have some of the technical things to report. So in your report as clerk of session, part of what you do is the minutes of the previous meeting, which are for approval. And so that should be a regular piece of what you bring. And it usually happens close to the beginning of the meeting. Any changes to the roles. And so our membership roles include active members, affiliate members, which is a rarer category, baptized members, people, especially infants and kids who have been baptized, but they are not yet active members, baptized role. The role includes weddings, funerals, and baptisms. So any changes to those roles are part of the clerk's report. A change in membership numbers if somebody dies. So funerals also, if somebody dies, then they are removed from active membership. Their membership is a is heavenly now. And so that's part of the clerk's report. Membership is down by 1 because of the death of Mr. Johnson. If you've received any correspondence, and this is something that I think maybe we skip a bit. The PCUSA sends out a lot of correspondence, and if you don't get it, let me know, and we can fix that. But they'll send out information on the special offerings a couple months before those happen. They'll send out information about some of the nationwide conferences. There's an upcoming evangelism conference in October. So they'll send out things, and it's appropriate as clerk of session to report that if the pastor's not reporting it. You may also sometimes receive correspondence asking for use of the building, asking for a donation to a local fund. Anything you receive by email or in physical mail that is related to the life of the church should be a part of your report to the session. And then there are those annual requirements, and we'll touch on those some more in the minutes review piece. But any of the actions related to those annual requirements, like annually reviewing your insurance or your rolls, that's appropriate to have in your report. And one of the other shortcuts you can have, if you do set up a template, in your template, you can have information like in June, we need to start the process of reviewing our insurance. So you've got that in front of you, because one of the things you get to do as clerk of session is sometimes remind the session, remember, we need to review our safe church policy. We need to at least pull it out and take a look at it. We need to review our insurance. We need to review our rolls. And so if you have your own list of when those things happen in the annual rhythm of the church, you can be part of saying, it's time again. And then anything else that is customary for the particular life of your church, or anything else that that will benefit the record of the work of the church, that won't show up in another committee report or the pastor's report. Any questions? There usually is a pastor's report, not always. Sometimes it will be written, sometimes it will be verbal. It is usually the pastor who comes to the session to ask for the approval of baptisms, weddings in the building, or other kinds of special services, or receiving members. Often it's the pastor who will run a new members class. And so the pastor will come to the session and say, Bob and Jane would like to join the church. I've met with them, and they're ready to meet with the session to be received. That's a session action. Session has the authority to approve baptisms. The pastor, there are, of course, allowances in moments of emergency, in moments of a miscarriage or sudden death. If a pastor performs an emergency baptism, that is definitely allowed. But otherwise, the session has the authority to approve baptisms. And even in the case of an emergency baptism, the pastor needs to come back to the session and report that, so the session may signal its approval of that action. Sessions only approve weddings if they're in the building. So this is one of those pieces. The session has full right to approve or disapprove use of the building. They are the authority. So if somebody requests to have a wedding in your sanctuary, it's the session who makes that decision. If somebody asks the pastor to perform their wedding beside the lake or on the seashore, that's the pastor's decision. So the difference is use of the building versus pastoral participation. And then any other kinds of special services, any use of the building. That's the session's job. One of the things you can choose to do as you keep your minutes is either to include attachments if there are written reports where there's a lot of good information about the life of the church. You don't have to type all that in. You can indicate attached. I do that a lot. I'm not going to include all these reports in the minutes that show our actions. Those are attachments that go to speak to the actions of the body. Or if it's a shorter report, you can copy and paste it into your minutes. The one thing is, in the end, minutes of the session are public documents. They're a public record of the corporation. So be careful. As I said, the clerk in the last church I served would almost do a verbatim, and then we'd have to say, okay, this was a difficult conversation, and this information doesn't need to be in the minutes. The decision needs to be in the minutes. Some of this context is important, but we don't need the verbatim. So keep that in mind as you are including reports or other information. Same thing with committee reports. You may have committees that produce written reports on a regular basis. If you feel, as clerk of session, that they are important as a part of the historical record of the church, you can add them as attachments. In the minutes, though, in the body of the minutes, you do need to record any actions taken by committees. So you may have given the worship committee the authority to fill the pulpit, for instance. I mean, technically that's a session decision, but the session can say, we're going to authorize the worship committee to do this work. Still, when the worship committee comes back and reports, those actions need to be in the body of the minutes, not just in the attachment. Does that make sense, the difference there? Because again, that's the record of the actions of the church. And that's what you go back to and say, wait a minute, who invited that person again? We said we didn't ever want that connectional presbyter coming back. Who said that was okay? Well, you can go back to your minutes and say, oh, it was the worship committee. Talk to them. And any motions that come out of your committees. Perhaps the fellowship committee comes and says, we want to have a special party for our 300th anniversary. Any action the session takes goes in the body of the minutes. So sometimes it is necessary or important to go into what we call, and what Robert's Rules calls, executive session. This should be used really rarely. At the national level of the church, they will go into executive session to discuss legal matters that are privileged, property matters that need to remain confidential, or staff and personnel matters. So really sensitive things. It is the session that votes to enter executive session. So somebody will move it, second, all in favor, that kind of thing. If you're entering executive session and there are people who are not members of the session present, they at that point have to leave, unless the motion to move into executive session allows for certain guests to remain. So for instance, the Presbyterian Historical Society is overseen by the Office of the General Assembly as part of the stated clerk's responsibility. And there were some conversations about that property, because it's a significant piece of property, and conversations about the best ways to utilize it. The body, the Committee on the Office of the General Assembly, would vote to move into executive session, including the director of the Presbyterian Historical Society and these particular members of their board. And so they were allowed to remain. Everyone else had to depart at that time. Executive sessions don't require minutes, but sometimes the topic being discussed does need to be recorded. And so one way to do that is to record those minutes, read them back before the executive session ends. So once the conversation that you needed to have in executive session, which is like the cone of silence. Session meetings should be confidential anyway. In terms of the conversation, executive session meetings are cone of silence level. So once you finish the conversation, as clerk of session, if a record of the conversation is necessary, you would read that back to the body so they could approve it before leaving executive session. And then that record would be kept separate. It does not become part of the minutes of the church. It is a confidential record of an executive session discussion. There are different ways to keep that. It can be a password protected file on a computer. It can be in a different area if you have filing cabinets and keep minutes physically at the church in a different area. It could be in a locked file in the pastor's office. There are different ways to keep that, but it remains separate. It remains separate. If you take, yeah, go ahead.
That's not in the binder that gets approved.
No, yeah. And sometimes it's necessary. So one example would be inappropriate personnel, actions or speech. To keep a record of a conversation about how to discipline or censure or whatever's necessary a staff member who is acting in ways that are detrimental to the life of the church. That's an important conversation, and you want to record what the particulars were. So this is the difference. You go into executive session and you say, pick on a secretary. The secretary has been heard berating members over the phone for not being in worship, and the secretary has sent emails that are accusatory and angry. So the actions, the details of what's been going on, you might want to keep a record of that in case future disciplinary action is necessary. Mm-hmm. So those things would be in the record. If then the session says, these are the actions we're going to take, we are going to have these two people sit with the secretary and say that this kind of behavior is inappropriate and unacceptable. This is a warning. You will be under probation for 30 days. If you continue this behavior or do other things that are inappropriate and unacceptable, you will be terminated for cause. So that's an action that gets recorded, but the details of why the action is necessary, those remain separate. Does that make sense? It's kind of a weird thing, but it allows us to have some really difficult conversations in a way that seeks to protect. So if action is taken in executive session, that action has to be reported. There are very rare exceptions to this, which would hardly ever be something experienced at the church level. So just as a rule of thumb, if you go into executive session, if you vote to take action, the action is reported in the minutes, not the content, just the action. And I'll just say, I am sure you all know, but I'll say it anyway. As ordained officers in the church, because to be a clerk of session, you are a ruling elder, we are mandatory reporters. So if the executive session has to do with abuse or harm towards a minor or an adult who is compromised in any way, you can't keep that secret. We are mandatory reporters, and we have to take the steps to pursue safety for people who cannot pursue it for themselves. So, yeah, big important point. Okay, here we are. You've done all the work of the session meeting. Woo! It's time to adjourn. Record when the meeting adjourned, when you finished. Yay! But here's the thing, you don't have to vote to adjourn. At the beginning of the meeting, you would have approved a docket or an agenda. And so once you've completed your business, the meeting's done. The meeting's done. Unless someone moves to consider another item of business, once you've completed your agenda, your docket, you're done. So a vote to adjourn is not necessary. It is sometimes that joyful point when all those in favor stand up, all those in favor hold hands, whatever your culture is. It's fine to do it, but you don't have to. So you do have to adjourn in prayer and record that you have adjourned with prayer, and record the date and time of the next meeting. Another piece you can choose to add, this is a style piece. If there are action items for individuals, if the mission committee said, we're going to reach out to the school and find out what kids need help with school supplies, you could add that as an action item at the end of the minutes after the items around adjourning. And so have a list of action items that go, consolidated, go forward with the minutes. It's a good way to go back and check. Some people will put the action items at the top. They'll have the motions in a block, all the motions that were taken throughout the meeting, and then follow that with action items. It's a possible way. I mean, this is one of the things you get to do. You get to decide how your minutes are organized. You don't have to organize them chronologically. So they follow every piece of the meeting in order. You can choose to organize the minutes in such a way that they communicate, here are our actions, here are things in process, or our to-do list, or who said they do what. Here are ongoing items. You can do it that way. It's up to you. You have the power. Just beware, session has to approve it. So you have the power, but if you fill your minutes with unicorns and rainbows, session may say, wait a minute. All right. Before we move in the checklist, any question about taking the minutes? Any questions about taking the minutes?
You made a statement that the session is just for session members. Is that every session meeting?
So executive session is only for the
Right.
members of the body.
Okay.
It's kind of Session meetings are not closed. So people can ask to attend, they can show up to attend, but that does not give them the right to speak. Only the moderator can recognize somebody who's not a member of the session to speak. Sometimes you'll invite people who need to be present for the conversations, you know, based on
Right.
what's going on. If the Boy Scout troop comes and says, we actually need a little more space or a little more time, you might invite the troop leader to come and present to the session.
Right.
It would be unusual to ask somebody to leave. So in that sense, session meetings are meant to be open. They're the work of the church. And that's why we have the executive session option. So if there are difficult things that need to be discussed, you do have an option that allows the session to do that in a confidential manner. I don't know many churches where people are just showing up at session meetings, though. I mean, if that's happening for you, let me know. I want to find out what you're doing. Any other questions about taking the minutes? In a lot of ways, that's the primary thing you do. You record the actions of the church, and it's essential. It's so very, very important. And so it's okay to say, I need clarification on the wording. I need clarification on exactly what we're voting on, because chances are, if you need clarification, there are other people on the session who also need clarification. There are times as I take minutes, I will read back and say, this is what I think we're voting on. Let me read the language and you tell me if I've got it. So do that, make it an interactive thing. But in the end, your record of the meeting is a legal document. It can be used in a legal case. God forbid you ever have to have that. But it is a legal document of the council of the church, of the session. Yeah. All right. Any other questions? Then we're going to finish up by looking at the session minute review. Woo woo. So this is a requirement in our Book of Order. The Book of Order requires that, it's kind of interesting language, I looked it up, that the activity of lower councils be reviewed. And in Presbyterian language, council is the body. So the session is the council of the church. The presbytery is a council. The synod, our next regional body, is the council. The General Assembly is the highest council of our church. And so we're required to supervise, evaluate, and check in on the activities of our churches. The clearest way to do that is by reviewing our session minutes, because they are meant to be the record of the activity of our churches. And so our session minute review checklist has these items as standing items. These are the things we're going to ask for every year, no matter what. We're going to ask for records of your congregational meetings. You will have had at least one congregational meeting to elect officers, to elect elders, and if you have them, a board of deacons. Traditionally, usually, the clerk of session takes the minutes of the congregational meetings. That's pretty standard. Another clerk can be appointed, elected for the meeting, and that's true for session meeting as well. If you can't make a session meeting, then the session can appoint someone to take the minutes in your stead. We all get vacation sometimes, and there are, there's life. So we want to take a look at your congregational meetings. Are people being nominated properly by a nominating committee? Are people being elected to these offices? If you have an installed pastor, you would also approve any changes to the terms of call for the installed pastor. So we'll look for that in. And then if there are other things, the congregation has very few things they take action on, but if we see in session minutes that the session voted to take out a loan in order to replace the roof, and there's no congregational meeting, well, the congregation has to approve taking out a loan. And actually the presbytery does too. And in our presbytery, that's the board of trustees has that authority. So that's part of what we're looking for, is the congregation doing the work that is particular to the congregation. We want to see the annual budget. That's an important piece of history. Sometimes that's included as the annual report as part of that year's documents. Sometimes it's included at the session meeting where it is approved. Here you go. Who approves the church's budget?
Session.
Session, yes. Session approves the church's budget. The only time the congregation approves financial things is for an installed pastor's terms of call, or for mortgages, sale of property, any encumbrance of property. But yeah, the budget is the sessions.
So you said about the annual report. I don't think I had seen that attached to the congregational meeting minutes, but we have quite an extensive, like a 30-some page annual report. Should that be included in our session minutes package?
Yeah, that's appropriate. I mean, that's a huge snapshot of your life of your church, the mission and ministry of the church.
I just didn't remember seeing that.
Yeah, we don't review that per se, unless it's to say, no, the budget's in the annual report. But
Okay.
in terms of preserving the record, it's appropriate to include that.
Okay.
For the session minute review checklist, we want to look through and see if changes in membership are recorded in your minutes. As I said earlier, things like deaths, new members, letters of transfer, those kinds of things. The session is the body that approves when we have communion. And so that needs to be in your minutes. Some churches do that on a monthly basis. Every month they will decide, or it'll be noted in the minutes every month. Some churches bring, the pastor usually, or the worship committee will bring a calendar for the year. And that calendar may note when communion is scheduled. Session approves that. That's an action. It goes in the minutes. So when the Lord's Supper is being observed, we don't require, this was an old requirement, so we don't require you to then report how many people took it. It used to be we were trying to, I don't know.
Trying to be Catholics?
Yeah, trying to make sure we controlled who got a little piece of Jesus. I don't know. Different time, different mindset. That's okay. But we do not require a number of how many people received, whether people who were not able to be physically in worship received. That's okay. And when the pandemic started in 2020, our stated clerk ruled that receiving communion remotely was appropriate, that the Holy Spirit is indeed able to be active regardless of whether we are physically present with one another. Yeah. So, yeah.
So if we have a tradition of just having the, I mean, I don't remember seeing this in minutes either, of having monthly, first Sunday of the month as our communion. Do we, like, at least annually, are we supposed to confirm that that's still in play? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. As I've already said, we're going to check. Did we open and close with prayer? I was part of an organization, and they asked me to be vice president. Then I became president for 2 years. But it was a secular organization. It was a nonprofit, but it was not a church nonprofit. And oh man, it felt so weird starting those meetings and not praying. A couple of times I had to no. We open and close our meetings with prayer, and it's appropriate to do more than just pray. The session, they're part of the spiritual leadership of the church. And so, beginning a session meeting with a Bible study, with a devotion, with a time of reflection, I think personally is really important. So when I was a pastor of a church, we started with a Bible study every session meeting. And at first there was a little bit of pushback. We have a lot of business to do. But within months, everyone realized the business was better. The conversation was better. We were more centered. We didn't add time when we added 20 minutes of conversation about the Bible. So you don't just have to open and close with prayer. You can add more there. The Book of Order requires an annual review of finances, and that can be as simple as a financial review or as in-depth as an actual audit. One way to do financial reviews, depending on your church, is to establish an audit committee. And that's what they did at the last church I served. They had an audit committee. There were 3 members. And so someone was elected every year to the audit committee. A minimum of 2 members had to participate. So the 3rd member was kind of an alternate. It gave them some wiggle room. None of them were on session. You cannot be on session and serve on a financial review. The treasurer must not, shall not. That's one of those big prohibitions. Anyone who has anything to do with the money, it cannot lead a review. They're involved, of course, in providing the statements and the information, but they don't get to sign off on their own stuff. So if you're on a finance committee, you can't be on the audit review. If you are a financial review, if you deal with the money, if you sign checks, if you sign off on vouchers, if you use a voucher system, none of those people can be part of the annual financial review. So one way is to elect people who are not to do that work. And that's usually, a few hours, depending on the complexity of your church's finances. You can seek to exchange financial information with another congregation. Have pastors, or as clerks of session, if the session says, yeah, let's try this, you could reach out to a neighboring church and say, what if we review each other's finances? And then you've got that separation. You're not involved in the other church's finances, I don't think. If you are, let's have a conversation. And so that's another way to provide a review. However you do it, though, the Book of Order does require an annual review, and the results of that review must be noted in the minutes. And if they're not noted in the minutes, that's one of those things we pay really close attention to, because once or twice, yeah, that's fine. But if there's a running history of no financial review, no record of how that happened, then we start to worry. Churches, unfortunately, can be places where we say, no, we trust them. This isn't about trust. This is about good stewardship. And we're called to be good stewards. Another thing we look for in the session minute review is electing commissioners to presbytery meetings. Yes, it's the session that does that. Some churches elect somebody at the beginning of the year and say, you're it, you're all year. Some churches will say, oh, hey, there's a presbytery meeting this month. Who wants to go? Who can go? Who will go? But this is one of the ways that we're connected. And we are the presbytery. Yes, I serve the presbytery, but our churches make up the presbytery. It's not a them, it is an us. And if a session is not sending commissioners to presbytery meetings, they're absenting themselves from making decisions about our life together. So please come to presbytery meetings. We're trying to make it as accessible as possible with a hybrid model, and trying to include things that are interesting and not just running through the items of business. There is required an annual review of insurance, which is just good practice anyway. It's good practice in our homes and for our cars, the personal insurance we have. It's also required and good practice for our churches to make sure insurance coverage is sufficient, see if anything's changed, review what's covered. And part of what that can do is remind you that it's there to be used. It amazes me how often churches and sessions forget to call the insurance agency when there's a problem. And so, for instance, if again, God forbid, something happens and you get sued, you should have insurance for that. If someone sues the church because they fell on the sidewalk out in front of the church, your insurance company will appoint a lawyer to take care of that. If someone sues an officer of the church for some reason, you should have officer's insurance. So it's not just damage to buildings and property. And then we're going to ask every year that to see that you've reviewed your safe church policy. Part of that is just making sure you're following it. Again, this isn't about whether or not we trust people. It's about the fact that we are all human beings, and we have to work together to create safe spaces. So we'll ask for that every year.
Cindy,
Yeah.
on the last two items, I've traded books with a lot of churches over the years, and some of them have asked about seeing my insurance certificate. The session always approves renewal of or modifying the insurance policy, and that's what I put in the little block on the review sheet.
Yeah.
What's the current Newcastle Presbytery preference? Do you want to see the copies put in the minutes?
I don't need to see a copy as long as the action is recorded, that the session reviewed and approved the insurance. That's the necessary piece.
And the same on the safe church policy then. Yeah.
I will say, again, the historical piece, this is how we learn really hard lessons. So I am sure are aware that there are a lot of allegations of abuse lawsuits against the Boy Scouts of America, and they often meet in churches, and the Presbyterian Church has been a traditional supporter of scouting programs. So what's been happening with those lawsuits is churches are being sued as well. And they're being sued for instances that were 20, 30 years ago, not current memory. The challenge has been, it's not the current insurance that's going to cover that lawsuit. It's the insurance that was in place at the time of the occurrence. Does that make sense? So if Joe says the Scoutmaster abused me in 1980, it's the insurance that you had in 1980 that covers that lawsuit. And that's where including the certificate of insurance in your minutes and in your historical record becomes unfortunately helpful. So we have churches, we had so many churches in New York and New Jersey especially that have been sued, and they don't know. They don't know who their insurance was 20, 30 years ago. And in some cases we change, right? We change insurance because we'll find out that this other company has better rates, is more favorable to a worshiping community. We'll change our insurance companies. And so I'm not going to look for it in your minutes. However, it might be good. And at the very least, if not including the certificate of insurance, including the particulars. The session reviewed and approved, continuing to be insured by Omaha Mutual, by whoever, by the insurance group, including that information. I pray to God you never need it. But if you do, it's there. It's there.
I hope the next generation.
Yeah. And the same thing's true with the safe church policy. That's one of those tricky places. When I'm asked about letting other groups use our buildings, I recommend that they be required to abide by the safe church policy of the church. Because that's your policy. You get to set the rules on how people engage within the space of the church. And so I recommend that they receive the copy, they sign off, they're going to agree to it, and that's entered into the minutes. You can't monitor them. You can't monitor them, but that's the other safeguard in the case of something terrible happening. You've got that record. We informed them they had to follow our safe church policy. Here's what was in place at the time that they entered into a lease agreement with us. Here's the record of them agreeing. Those kinds of documents should be mentioned in the minutes, and then the actual signed copies kept in a file electronically or physically. And I hate that we have to, even as we think about keeping a historical record of the mission and ministry of the body of Christ, we're also thinking about the legal ramifications. And what can we do to protect the mission and ministry of the body of Jesus Christ? Yeah. All right. Woo! Other questions, other things that you're just dying to know about? Yeah, Nancy.
I have a question. I had a lot of pushback about the audit committee. And so I'm wondering if there are other churches or at least one other church that would like to partner with us so we could set up some sort of mutual audit committee. I heard all these excuses like, oh, it was expensive last time we did it, or I don't know how many excuses I got, but I'd like to be able to go and give them an alternative that's not going to cost them a lot of money, but will, fulfill the obligations we have.
Yeah.
Where are you, Nancy?
What did you say, Bill?
Where are you?
Newark.
That's not bad.
I'll ask the ladies that did our audit if they would like to visit Newark and
Okay, and which church are you? I'm sorry, I don't know.
West Nottingham.
Oh, you're close then. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, they had such a wonderful time doing the financial review.
They did, huh?
I'll see if I can do any arm twisting in a nice and comfortable way.
Yeah,
All right, I like that.
that's awesome. Thank you. Other questions? So a question I got just today or yesterday was on roles. Previously, and this has been at least 10 years ago now, I think, we had an inactive role as one of our roles. And the Book of Order doesn't provide for that anymore. You're either active or you're not. So in terms of the required roles by the Book of Order, it's baptized, active, affiliate. That does not prevent a session from creating other roles. If you feel like you have reason to do so. For instance, well, I was going to say, if you have a lot of college students, you might create a role that reflects that they're not currently active. They're still members, but they're not currently active. The church, again, the church I served last, had some of those delicate memberships. You know, it's the grandchildren of the matriarch, patriarch, who probably are never ever going to come back, but any conversation about removing them from the roles just was heartbreaking. So the session decided to create an inactive member role. So they're still members, but they're inactive. It doesn't exist in the Book of Order, but you as session may say, we need a way to hold people who are still connected to our community, but are no longer active in worship or in the life of the church. So you're allowed to do that. Yeah. And that's just a session action. Sandra?
But doesn't that impact per capita?
Yes,
Like
it does.
So if they're an inactive member, they're keeping track of them, but since they're not an active member, they don't have to pay per capita.
That's correct. Yeah.
And every once in a while, one of those or two of those inactives show up again, which
Yeah.
is really nice.
Every
They didn't
once
get
in a while.
booted out.
Yeah, yeah. And you don't have to have that conversation of, you're actually not a member.
I'm sure I was 30 something or maybe close to 40 when I actually transferred from the church that I grew up in and had not gone to for 20 years. Yeah.
Yeah. And it is an annual duty of the session, at least annual, to review the roles. And often we do that with an eye towards per capita and not paying for people who aren't involved. But it's also pastoral care. You know, if there are people who cared enough about the church to join at some point, part of our responsibility is to follow up on that relationship. And sometimes the answer is a closed door or no answer at all. But part of our pastoral care is saying, hey, we miss you. And that's part of the review of the roles.
Is review of the roles supposed to be in the meeting minutes? Like,
yeah, that is supposed to be an annual.
that's not just the clerks. That's not just the clerks tabulating, but like the session should do a review.
Yeah, and it's often the clerk that says, let's review the roles. It can also be done in pieces, depending on the size of your church. You know, say, we're going to review the roles, or the clerk can come and say, these are people who are on our rolls who have not been active in worship in the last 6 months. How can we and that may be a previous conversation with the pastor. How can we reach out to them? Who will be in contact? So that's one of the things you can help the session pay attention to in your role. Well, as always, the opportunity to ask questions doesn't end when the Zoom ends. So as questions come up, please feel free to reach out to me. And we continue. So I'm continuing usually on the third Thursday to offer some kind of training, usually at 5 p.m. for an hour. I knew we need a little more time tonight. And that collection of materials and videos is available on our website. And I'm going to put the link in the chat for you. So if you go to ncpresbytery.org, you can either type in /training or you'll see the training tab. And so there's a system training on trustees and finance committees and what their powers are, training on stewardship, training on bylaws. So this year with our session minutes review, I asked for copies of your bylaws and training on what should be in them, how to keep them up to date, those kinds of things. Next month, September, the 15th of September is the third Thursday. My plan is to offer something at 5 p.m. I'm actually in conversation with Ellie Johns Kelly, who is our Ministry Relations Officer with the Presbyterian Foundation. So I'm hoping she'll be able to join us and share a little bit about the resources at the foundation level, which are immense. They have so many resources between investing, stewardship resources, building resources. If you want to work with somebody to think about your building and use of the building, the foundation has fantastic resources. So hopefully Ellie will be with us in September. If not, I'll think of something else and let you all know. So any last questions before we close in prayer? Glad you could join. Let's pray. Oh Lord, you are good. You are good to us. And we are grateful for this day that is coming to a close as the sky grows dark and the stars come out. Thank you for the ways you have blessed us this day. Help us live our lives full of gratitude, remembering all the time that you are with us, you're walking with us, you're watching over us. And in all times and places, you are indeed the one we can turn to and lean on. Be with our clerks of session, guide them, grant them strength and perseverance, but also good humor as they do this important work for the church. And lift these prayers in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.